Today, Trump laid out another part of his economic agenda, saying he would put a 200% tariff on John Deere imports if the company moves production to Mexico as planned.
A 200% tariff on John Deere and blanket duties on Ford were supposed to bring jobs back to America. That was the promise. But instead of rebuilding the heartland, corporate leaders quietly shifted billions in investment to Mexico, Brazil, and Vietnam, leaving American towns behind once again. Rust Belt communities, already worn thin from decades of factory closures, got no revival. Just more boarded-up shops, higher equipment costs, and debt piling up faster than most families can keep pace with. Speeches didn't fix any of it, and now every farm and empty Main Street is a quiet reminder that the real decisions weren't made on stage. They were made in silence, far from public view. Who's really profiting from these tariffs? How did the biggest corporations sidestep the loudest tariff threat in a generation? And more importantly, what can you do before your next loan comes due? Stay with us. We're unpacking the truth behind the chaos and showing you how to protect what's yours. Calculated expansion. Behind closed doors in Moline, Illinois, Deere executives had drawn the map long before any public threats. Spread across glossy conference room tables were blueprints for new assembly plants in Brazil and India, staggered timelines for advanced automation in Germany, and research partnerships with suppliers across Asia. A mid-year memo stated plainly, "Our allegiance is to competitiveness, not cultural loyalty tests." The executives knew that doubling down on American soil, amid rising labor costs and regulatory complexity, would be suicidal. By mid-2023, Deere had already committed $300 million to the Bahia Plata facility in Brazil and $250 million to an expansion in Pune, India. Those investments promised lower overhead and faster access to emerging markets. Meanwhile, Europe's factories were integrating robotics at a pace that outstripped U.S. counterparts by 20%. Deere's leadership recognized that tariffs, no matter how severe, would not shift their strategic calculus. If anything, they validated it. In the boardroom, technology officers contrasted theatrics with logic, arguing that policy shocks were inevitable in a global economy. They envisioned a network of steel forests sprouting in lower-cost regions, hedging against any single nation's political risks. When the president's tariff announcement hit the news, it landed not as deterrence but as proof that Deere had made the right choice. Trump's threats landed not as deterrence but as proof. Strategic silence. No press, no noise. Just midnight machines in Mexico and secret deals in Vietnam. Ford slashed U.S. investments by 15% and changed the game overnight. On a misty morning at the Dearborn, Michigan Assembly Hall, line workers discovered the news piecemeal. A radio blared a local report about expanded Ford operations in Mexico to compete on cost, and murmurs spread that production of familiar models would pause for months. A veteran technician recalled the paradox. Here we are, making history in silence while the world watches speeches. Ford's chief operations officer later termed the maneuver a masterclass in strategic silence, explaining that when every decision is measured in efficiency points, patriotism can become a costly luxury. Decisions hinged on material sourcing and labor economics. Executives calculated that producing vehicles entirely within domestic borders, amid wage inflation and tightening environmental regulations, would raise unit costs by nearly 20%. Global logistics experts mapped routes from Mexican border crossings to North American distribution hubs, optimizing cargo loads and reducing lead times by weeks. At investor presentations in New York, these silent expansions were showcased as evidence of resilience, not retreat. Quarterly earnings calls celebrated margin improvements without revealing the full scope of offshore investments. A gulf of disbelief opened between campaign stage promises and boardroom realpolitik. The machinery of commerce had shifted beneath the nation's feet, leaving communities to reckon with an offstage reality they barely understood. Savior unmasked. Detroit's champion transformed into a stranger in its own showrooms. Dealers who once festooned hood emblems with presidential flags found themselves hastily removing political banners as customers balked at sudden price hikes. A survey of auto manufacturing counties revealed a 30% plunge in consumer trust among those who had cheered the tariff rhetoric. Showroom managers reported empty sales floors, where once the din of negotiation and engine revs filled the air. In a small-town dealership outside Columbus, Ohio, The owner recounted a routine oil change customer turned critic. He glanced at the invoice and said, "If you tack on $10,000 for a new pickup, I'll take my business elsewhere." That single moment crystallized the unraveling myth of the populist warrior. Once, red meat speeches had seemed anthemic. Now they echoed hollowly across vacant service bays. Sales teams accustomed to demagogic pep rallies now paced showrooms stripped of political paraphernalia. In break rooms, staff exchanged bewildered glances as they updated pricing sheets to reflect punitive duties. Mechanics, who prided themselves on maintaining every model with skill, concealed frustration when told parts would arrive weeks late and cost significantly more. The theater of politics clashed head-on with the cold calculus of commerce. The leader who vowed to bring auto jobs roaring back discovered that a factory's loyalty cannot be summoned by slogans alone. Trust slipped through the cracks like oil on a concrete floor, leaving behind raw reality in place of grand narratives. We tracked the speeches, the supply chains, and the silent shifts behind the curtain, so you didn't have to. If this helped connect the dots or challenged what you've been told, hit subscribe. It's the one way you can make sure the truth keeps cutting through the noise. When promises collide, threats flew, and corporate America simply adjusted its flight path. In a discreet conference suite near Capitol Hill, trade association lobbyists monitored every tariff declaration with composed detachment and a growing sense of inevitability. General Motors quietly accelerated plans for an assembly line in Ulsan, South Korea, pouring $200 million into a joint venture projected to begin production in 2025. At the same moment, Caterpillar executives signed off on a $300 million expansion outside Pune, India, lured by generous tax incentives, expedited permitting, and a workforce trained by state-sponsored programs. Meanwhile, chambers of commerce in Warsaw, Poland, toasted Whirlpool's decision to shift major appliance manufacturing to a repurposed factory on the Vistula River, cutting overhead by 15% almost overnight and signaling a quiet but permanent retreat from Midwest labor markets. A veteran lobbyist captured the prevailing attitude with disarming honesty. "You threaten us with tariffs, and we adjust our global scorecards." Executives no longer reached for patriotic slogans. They leaned into actuarial models and meticulously crafted forecasts that revealed even a 200% levy could be absorbed as a modest line item, especially when offset by rising domestic labor costs and an increasingly tangled web of environmental and zoning regulations. Stakeholders, once roused by nationalistic appeals, now cheered rising profit margins and predictable supply chains. Market analysts dissected the so-called loyalty test into three components: loyalty, shame, consequence, only to conclude that none carried more weight than the raw arithmetic of global profit. In high-rise boardrooms, mergers and acquisitions teams convened not to resist pressure, but to update slide decks. Overseas facilities now featured prominently under growth drivers, while domestic factories were quietly recategorized as legacy assets. These strategic, unspectacular shifts pointed to a deeper reality, one that no stump speech could rewrite. In modern capitalism, balance sheets wield more power than ballots. Loyalty tests reside not in statutes, but in spreadsheets. And when the final verdict arrived, it wasn't delivered through political spectacle, but through silent, irreversible decisions. In this clash between political thunder and corporate calculation, the real narrative was never in what was shouted on stage, but in what was done, quietly and decisively, behind the curtains. Heartland Flashpoint. In Iowa's Tillgrass country, the tariff landed like a betrayal. A 200% rate hike on imported agricultural machinery translated into a 30% jump in financing costs. One combined replacement that once carried a sticker price of $85,000 now threatened to exceed $110,000 before taxes and fees. Farmers huddled at diner counters, scanning spreadsheet printouts and recalculating seasonal budgets on credit union calculators. A third-generation farmer recalled stories of the post-industrial heyday, when local foundries hummed with molten steel and harvest seasons, depended on homegrown equipment. He shook his head and murmured, "They promised a revival, but this feels like a thunderclap." Farm equipment dealers began fielding calls from families asking whether loan terms could be renegotiated or leases extended. One local credit union reported a fourfold surge in refinancing inquiries. Can a harvest endure when the cost of replacing a vital machine doubles in a single political decision? That question hovered over fields left unseeded, where planters sat idle beneath April's uncertain sky. Conversations in feed stores shifted from commodity forecasts to existential doubts. Would their president protect their livelihoods or price them out of their own land? That echo shattered more than applause. Showrooms went quiet. Empty aisles spoke louder than any protest sign. At a small-town dealership near Green Bay, Wisconsin, foot traffic sank by 30% in the days following the tariff announcement. Sales managers circled week-over-week declines on whiteboards that once brimmed with targets and incentives. Prospective buyers who had toured chrome-bright showrooms now lingered at the door, scanned their phones, and walked away. A service technician, accustomed to the drone of hydraulic lifts and engine revs, described a new soundtrack: the distant hum of unreturned phone calls. He confessed, "I keep checking my schedule, hoping for new work orders, but there's only silence." Dealership owners, who once draped campaign flags over hood ornaments, began discreetly folding banners into storage bins. Their customers no longer saw these businesses as community cornerstones, but as front lines in a political struggle. That quiet resistance required no placards. Each no sale, each canceled trade-in, each postponed oil change became a quiet withdrawal of trust. In this hushed revolt, customers communicated their discontent through absent signatures on dotted lines and deferred credit application forms. The absence of noise spoke volumes about fear, frustration, and fractured faith in both corporate promises and political protection. Silence revealed deep-seated dread in every corner. Broken chains. Tariffs served as wrecking balls to global supply networks. At major ports along the Gulf of Mexico, container yards swelled as customs officials enforced punitive duties. Lead times for precision hydraulic pumps jumped from 6 weeks to 18 weeks. Semiconductor shortages stretched assembly line delays into months. United States suppliers scrambled to cobble together replacement components, but could not match the scale or cost efficiency of established foreign partners. One logistics director held an emergency call. "Containers are stranded in Houston, while our assembly lines in Illinois have gone dark." That bottleneck rippled across the Midwest. Steel foundries in Indiana deferred orders. Casting shops in Ohio idled furnaces. And freight companies in Michigan struggled to reroute shipments around tariff zones. Raw material vendors saw invoicing stalled by paperwork and penalty fees. Tariffs shattered chains woven across continents, exposing how deeply American industry relied on global synergies. Nationalist slogans rang hollow as factories ground to a halt. Workers furloughed in one state echoed the frustration of dock workers in another. Businesses once celebrated as pillars of local economies now teetered on insolvency. When global links fracture, entire systems grind to a halt. Portfolio panic. A crackling alert on a smartphone shattered a retiree's morning routine. Decades of careful saving erased in an instant. Ford's stock price plummeted by 27%, wiping out more than $40 billion in market capitalization within a single trading week. John Deere's shares collapsed by $36 billion in just 5 trading days, a drop that even the most seasoned investors described as a cold, calculated exodus. Those headline figures pale beside the personal toll. Pensioners who had relied on equity dividends to supplement shrinking Social Security checks watched their nest eggs vanish pixel by pixel. County pension boards in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana scrambled to recalculate benefit payouts, while small-town banks fielded a flood of anxious calls. An Ohio retiree recounted his disbelief over morning coffee. "I thought long-term investment meant stability. Then the numbers turned red, and so did my balance." Financial advisors, normally reserved in tone, described emergency strategy sessions to reallocate remaining funds into safer assets, municipal bonds and treasury notes, as clients begged for ways to stem further losses. Community bulletin boards filled with tales of wiped-out retirement accounts and families forced to delay medical procedures or downsize homes. That financial earthquake was not merely about shifting share prices. It became a visceral betrayal of trust. News outlets chronicled the carnage with breathless urgency. But behind every statistic stood a person facing uncertainty at the kitchen table. A former auto worker, whose pension included a lump sum of Ford equity, admitted, "It felt like my livelihood was weaponized." Wall Street does not forget, and it certainly does not forgive. Boardroom counterstrike. In penthouse suites and private dining rooms, Fortune 500 executives orchestrated a covert counteroffensive. No press conferences announced their gatherings. Instead, discreet invitations arrived via encrypted channels to board members of leading corporations. Over candlelit dinners in Manhattan and secluded retreats outside Washington, D.C., chief executive officers drafted legal white papers, challenging tariff authority, and plotted back-channel lobbying efforts. Trade association representatives prepared detailed memos warning of systemic risk, while in-house counsel examined constitutional grounds to contest presidential import duties. Several companies quietly earmarked campaign contributions for primary challengers advocating free trade policies. Behind closed doors, one logistics magnate muttered, "This is not about politics, it is about survival." Every corporate leader understood that sustained tariff escalation threatened long-term planning, capital allocation, and shareholder value. The counterstrike unfolded in silence, its mechanisms hidden from public view. Legal teams filed motions in federal courts, even as government officials touted the moral high ground. Economic pressure mounted through coordinated actions that spoke louder than any televised rebuttal. Delayed capital spending, postponed plant expansions, and subtle shifts in investment portfolios. Boardroom strategy sessions became sanctuaries of sober calculation, where loyalty to a nation yielded to fiduciary duty. That strategic dissent proved more powerful than any rally stage roar. Crossfire in cornfields. Towns built on rich soil and community ties found themselves caught in a brutal tug-of-war. Farmers and factory workers, once united by a shared pledge for American resurgence, discovered they were on the front lines of a conflict they never chose. County fairs turned tense as tractor parades morphed into silent protests. Equipment dealerships saw sales teams exchange worried glances instead of handshake deals. Union halls that once rang with solidarity became forums for anguished debate over loyalty and livelihood. A union representative in Iowa described the scene. "We stood shoulder to shoulder with Trump's promise of restoration. Now our members feel abandoned, their jobs and homes at risk." With maintenance schedules postponed and parts delays stretching into months, mechanics idled by empty service bays wondered how they would feed their families. Mental health hotlines registered a surge in calls from distraught workers facing foreclosure or bankruptcy. Churches hosted prayer gatherings for laid-off employees, a poignant reminder of faith under duress. This crossfire of economic and emotional pain revealed fissures in communities once proud of their industrial heritage. Local food banks reported increased demand as household budgets crumbled under rising equipment and vehicle costs. School funding shortfalls loomed when property tax revenues shrank alongside property values, threatening extracurricular programs and teacher salaries. Collateral damage never felt this close to home. A new triangle. While American heartland factories dimmed their lights, a new manufacturing axis rose across continents. Investment in United States factories declined by double digits over a 5-year span, even as capital spending in Mexico surged in regions from Baja California to Guanajuato. Major automotive and agricultural corporations expanded facilities in Hermosillo and León, drawn by generous tax incentives and established supply chain corridors. Simultaneously, Vietnam emerged as a burgeoning hub for electronics and light machinery, luring components once sourced exclusively from domestic suppliers. Trade economists pointed to a fundamental shift. the United States no longer held global manufacturing primacy. Charts tracking foreign direct investment showed inflows to Mexico and Vietnam, outpacing American factory projects by 20-1. Logistics corridors rerouted through Pacific ports as companies sought leaner routes and quicker turnaround times. In boardrooms and university think tanks, reports dubbed this the rise of a global triangle, where production, assembly, and distribution coalesced beyond national borders. That realignment solidified permanent changes in global supply dynamics. American workers and business owners found themselves waiting for initiatives that never arrived, while competitors in Asia and Latin America enjoyed the benefits of strategic foresight. The factories that once defined a national narrative had been quietly reborn elsewhere, leaving behind only empty floors and unfulfilled promises. The world did not wait for permission. It simply retooled. Dream deferred. The community historian unlocked the weather-worn doors of an echoing exhibit hall. Its display cases, once filled with photographs of bustling assemblies and shift whistles, now surrendered to dust. In towns across Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, the curator explained, the past 5 calendar years recorded the closure of more than 400 large factories. Each announcement arrived with the clinical coolness of an investor call. Yet on Main Street, the impact landed like a funeral bell. The historian pointed to a sepia print from 1955 showing line workers clustered around a newly minted tractor. That pride, she whispered, carried families through prosperity and hardship alike. Gradually, that heartbeat slowed. Automation spread from pilot projects in suburban research parks to full robotic lines in coastal Chinese cities. By the time local councils begged for tax credits, the machinery had already crossed oceans. Property values fell as mortgage defaults crept up. Grocery stores condensed to a single aisle of essentials. The historian traced an invisible thread connecting shuttered plants to vacant classrooms, to the surge in opioid addiction cases, tracked by the county coroner. Once the promise of Made in America felt carved in steel. Now it resembled faint lettering fading from a rusted sign. Legacy banners were carefully folded, their bold letters dimmed by fluorescent flicker. In the emptiness lingered a question more potent than any campaign speech. What fills the vacuum when the machines fall silent? The curator shut the door behind her, knowing no exhibit could capture the quiet ache left behind. A symbol had not merely dimmed, its absence shouted across generations. A faded emblem speaks louder than 1,000 patriotic slogans whispered into vacant halls. Faces of fallout. The social worker in East Texas kept a clipboard heavy with names, ages, and crisis line numbers. Each household told a story beyond statistics. A machinist too proud to apply for assistance now pawning wedding bands. A former parts runner spiraling into depression after 20 resumes vanished into automated portals. In 1 week, 3 families were evicted from modest ranch homes they had hoped to pay off before their children finished secondary school. During home visits, she noticed refrigerators humming almost empty. Parents stretched pasta dinners across 2 evenings, assuring their children it was a fun experiment rather than a desperate measure. Clinics once seeing routine checkups now juggled anxiety attacks and hypertension linked to financial stress. When a dealership shuttered on the outskirts of town, the pharmacy nearby lost its lunchtime rush, trimming hours and laying off clerks who in turn canceled dental appointments. The collapse rippled like concentric rings in a drying pond. In church basements converted into temporary job training centers, she heard the same refrain. We were told to adapt, reskill, wait. They waited while equipment prices climbed, while unemployment forms froze under backlog, while promised reinvestment bypassed their county for distant shores. A man clutching a folder of repossession notices admitted, voice shaking, that he no longer recognized his own town. The social worker wrote referrals, scheduled therapy sessions, yet wondered how to mend faith when factories, storefronts, and futures closed in tandem. Economic pain wears a human face, and that face now burns with quiet endurance that belies its deep scars. No victory here. A pollster inside a modest suite along Pennsylvania Avenue, reviewed the latest crosstabs in astonishment. Counties that delivered landslide victories only 2 electoral cycles earlier now reported trust deficits wider than the Mississippi River. Among self-identified lifelong conservatives, approval of the tariff strategy plunged from nearly 2/3 support to barely 1/3. The numbers told a bipartisan tale of disillusion. Independents recoiled at higher grocery receipts linked to transport costs, while union households condemned layoffs wrought by parts shortages. Focus group recordings captured the emotional inversion. A farmer in western Ohio said, "I voted believing we would bring jobs home. Instead, my parts come with a surcharge and a 6-month delay." A retired foundry supervisor in Wisconsin described a fractured identity. Flags still flutter on porches, yet inside we feel sold out. In every demographic cell, hope drained when promises met price tags. Faith in swift revival gave way to the pragmatism of household ledgers. The pollster mapped sentiment county by county. Swaths of red and blue faded to muted gray, a fractured mirror reflecting economic anxiety. Campaign strategists phoned for clarifications, struggling to craft messages that could bridge the chasm. No speechwriter could spin repossessed tractors or canceled pension checks. The narrative of triumph faltered under the arithmetic of real life. Polling lines blurred between established camps, leaving only broken confidence and unanswered questions about who, if anyone, would champion those left in the wake. When convictions erode, the silence in survey responses can thunder louder than any rally chant. Beyond the off-ramp, a state senator from Ohio addressed a packed town hall where folding chairs scraped concrete and tempers flared hotter than summer asphalt. Constituents demanded to know why a sweeping 200% tariff, never debated in committee, never subject to public hearing, could uproot livelihoods overnight. She explained that legislative pathways offered few levers once executive authority invoked trade powers, an answer that drew frustrated sighs and a few raised fists. Back at the Capitol, budget analysts tallied predictable shortfalls. Sales tax revenues falling as truck purchases stalled. Property assessments sliding with each boarded-up storefront. Healthcare costs rising alongside unemployment claims. The senator's staff compiled case studies. A family dairy selling prized Holsteins to cover escalating feed costs. A parts supplier letting skilled welders go after international clients canceled contracts in fear of retaliatory duties. Draft bills to create emergency relief funds languished amid partisan disputes over spending caps. Meanwhile, foreign trade partners imposed their own levies on American grain, bourbon, and machinery. Farm cooperative boards warned that export volumes could shrink by 1/4 within a single season. The senator realized the off-ramp touted by national leaders was a mirage. Once a trade war ignited, neither side could reverse easily without appearing weak. Town hall attendees who once waved campaign signs now questioned whether any elected official could steer the runaway policy train back onto stable tracks. Share your story in the comments, then subscribe and join us for tomorrow's unfolding reckoning.